Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Caldwell called her when she asked for a schedule adjustment, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd never been told no by someone beneath him. 3 years. Sarah Chen had worked the night shift at Seattle General in Norfolk for 3 years without a single incident, and that invisibility was exactly how she designed it. No spotlight. No questions. No one looking too closely at the surgical precision in how she prepped for lines with one hand while charting with the other, muscle memory from a life she was supposed to forget. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone above her as she moved through the trauma ward at midnight, her faded scrubs catching the reflection of monitors displaying the steady rhythm of sleeping patients. The smell of antiseptic hung sharp in her nostrils, a scent she'd learned to find comforting instead of haunting, though it carried memories she kept locked behind her sternum. Her fingers never trembled. They moved with the kind of efficiency that should have raised questions, but nurses worked fast at Seattle General, and most people saw what they expected to see, a contract nurse doing her job, nothing more, nothing exceptional. The dog tag felt cold against her collarbone where it hung on a broken chain beneath her scrubs. She touched it between patients, a habit 3 years old, her thumb tracing the raised letters that spelled a name that didn't exist anymore. Major. That word lived only in sealed files now, in classified folders she wasn't supposed to access, in a life she'd been ordered to erase so completely that even her fingerprints had been redacted from the official record. The other night shift nurses sometimes asked about the faint scars on her forearms during coffee breaks, the thin white lines that mapped trauma across her skin like topography, but Sarah had learned to redirect those conversations with practiced ease. Schedule swaps. Recommendations for the good dermatologist. Questions about their own lives that made them forget they'd asked anything about hers. She was invisible, and invisibility was a form of armor. Dr. Caldwell watched her from the nurse's station with eyes that didn't quite believe what they were seeing. He'd been the chief of emergency services at Seattle General for 11 years, and he knew the difference between a contract nurse and someone who moved like a trained operative. The way Sarah calculated medication dosages in her head without checking the chart. The way she positioned her body when assisting with a particularly difficult intubation, not helpfully hovering, but standing exactly where a surgical assistant would stand, anticipating the next move before it was requested. Her hand steady as surgical steel when handling the 14-gauge angiocath needles, inserting them with the kind of precision that suggested she'd placed thousands. He'd mentioned it once to the hospital administrator during a staffing meeting, just an observation, nothing more. But even as he said it, he could see the way Sarah's composure never cracked when she caught him watching. She just continued her work, professional and efficient, never meeting his gaze directly but somehow aware of it all the same. That awareness was what bothered him most. That awareness suggested she was hiding something. The overhead speaker crackled at 0100 hours with the kind of urgency that changed everything. Medevac inbound from Bagram. Priority trauma. Commander James Hartley, Coast Guard, critical condition. 14 minutes out. The words hung in the fluorescent air like a physical thing. Sarah's hand froze mid-reach for a clipboard she'd been about to grab, her fingers suspended in space for exactly 1 heartbeat before she forced her shoulders down and turned toward the emergency bay doors. 1 heartbeat was all it took. 1 moment where the armor cracked just enough for anyone paying attention to see something real underneath. Dr. Caldwell was paying attention. He'd always been paying attention. From the nurse's station, he watched her face go pale, watched her hand tremble for the first time in 3 years, watched her pull in a breath that suggested she was bracing for impact, and he understood with sudden cold clarity that Sarah Chen recognized that name. More than recognized it. Feed it! The emergency bay burst into choreographed motion. The team at Seattle General had drilled this enough times that the movements came reflexively, crash carts positioned, trauma beds stripped to clean sheets, blood products hung from rapid infusion lines already labeled and ready, the kind of organized chaos that only happens when a hospital knows exactly what's coming. Sarah moved with everyone else, but something had shifted in her. The invisible efficiency remained, but it was threaded now with something else. Tension. Calculation. The way someone moves when they're running tactical assessments instead of just doing their job. She gathered trauma shears and dressings, counted units of O-negative blood, verified the suction equipment with her hands moving through the checklist so quickly it looked like a blur to anyone not trained to watch for it. Dr. Caldwell could see her lips moving, just barely, counting something under her breath. Not the medical supplies. Something else. Something her body remembered even though her mind was trying to keep it compartmentalized. "Status report," Dr. Caldwell called out, his voice cutting across the controlled urgency of the room. The flight nurse's voice came through the radio with the flat effect of someone who delivered bad news too many times to feel it anymore. "Commander Hartley, 46, shrapnel wounds to the right thorax and abdomen, lost approximately 2 liters of blood in the field, tension pneumothorax on the right, needle decompression successful in the helicopter, heart rate 142, blood pressure 78/55 and dropping despite 2 liters crystalloid. Estimated arrival 12 minutes. The radio hissed and clicked back to silence. Someone whistled low, "Too much blood loss, too much damage," the kind of trauma that sometimes didn't end in recovery. Sarah's hands continued their work without pause, but her breathing had changed. Shallower. Controlled. The kind of breathing someone does when they're deliberately slowing their heart rate, and Dr. Caldwell recognized that too. He'd seen it once before, in a documentary about Navy SEALs preparing for operations. Tactical breathing. Oxygen control. The conscious management of fear. The night stretched thin as Sarah moved through the final preparations. Other nurses would arrive when the medevac touched down, the attending surgeon, the anesthesiologist, the surgical techs, but these quiet minutes before the arrival were hers. The bay was her domain, and she'd prepared it with a kind of meticulous attention that suggested she'd done this before. Not in a hospital. Somewhere else. Somewhere that didn't have the luxury of time or equipment or the structured hierarchy of a civilian trauma center. She taped tubing to keep it organized. She verified the endotracheal tubes one more time. She checked the defibrillator pads and the suction line and the medications that would probably be needed if they were going to fight for his life instead of watching it slip away. Everything methodical. Everything precise. Everything done with the kind of authority that didn't match her title. "Sarah." Dr. Caldwell's voice came from directly behind her, and she didn't flinch. That was significant. Most people flinch when someone approaches silently and speaks, but Sarah's shoulders didn't tighten, her hands didn't stutter mid-movement. She simply turned to face him, her eyes carefully neutral, and he saw in that moment exactly how dangerous she was. It wasn't visible in any obvious way, no scars on her face, no military bearing, no hardness in her expression. It was there in her eyes instead. In the way someone looks at you when they've already run a dozen scenarios in their head about how this conversation might go, what you might be about to do, how they could respond. "You're not on the surgical team for this one." His words were casual, almost conversational, but they carried the weight of a command. "Once he arrives, you'll transition to the pediatric ward. We'll need someone with your attention to detail down there." Sarah held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds Dr. Caldwell saw something cross her face that he couldn't quite name. Not fear. Not anger. Something else. Something that looked almost like goodbye. "Yes, Dr. Caldwell," she said, her voice steady and deferential in the way that had made her invisible for 3 years. "Whatever you need." And the moment passed. She turned back to the equipment, and he watched her trace one hand briefly across the back of her neck, touching something beneath her scrubs that he couldn't quite see. A scar, maybe. Or something else. Something she carried with her always. The medevac was 7 minutes out. In her chest, beneath the faded blue scrubs and the careful construction of invisibility, Sarah Chen felt her entire world begin to collapse. She kept her hands moving. She kept her breathing steady. She kept the armor in place as the fluorescent lights hummed and the hospital held its breath and waited for the man who destroyed her to arrive broken and bleeding and completely unaware that the nurse standing in the trauma bay had been trained by the best operators the military had to produce, and that muscle memory was a force that didn't care about sealed files or redacted names or orders to disappear. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that the moment he arrived, she'd have to stand there and watch him and pretend she'd never seen his face before. The overhead page came at 0200 hours. Sarah heard her name distorted through the hospital's ancient speaker system, but the words that followed made her stomach drop. Nurse Nightingale to administration. Nurse Nightingale to administration. Not Sarah. Not Nurse Chen. Nightingale, a name someone had weaponized into mockery, turned into something syrupy and false. She kept her hand steady as she finished charting vitals for a post-op patient in the ICU, knowing every person on the floor had heard it. Knowing every head had turned. She took one measured breath and walked toward the administrative wing, her shoes silent on the tile despite the way her heartbeat moved like helicopter blades in her chest. Dr. Caldwell waited by the administrative office, arms crossed, his expression carved from something harder than stone. He didn't invite her inside. Instead, he gestured toward the back corridor, the supply closet where crash carts were restocked and nobody lingered past their retrieval time. Sarah followed because refusing would only escalate the message he was already sending. She was already outside the normal channels. Already under investigation. The closet door swung shut behind them, fluorescent light flickering from a ballast that needed replacing, casting them both in sickly white. "I've been making calls, Sarah." His voice stayed low, clinical, which was somehow worse than if he'd raised it. "Your credentials don't add up." He stepped closer, cutting off her access to the door. Shelving pressed against her back. Seattle General doesn't have room for nurses who fabricate their backgrounds. "Maybe you should tell me what you're really doing here before I have to tell the board." She didn't move. Didn't shift her weight. Her hands, those hands that had held hearts together in burning helicopters, remained at her sides. She met his eyes, pale blue, the color of ice forming over deep water, and took one measured breath. "I've been erased before, Dr. Caldwell." Her voice came out steady, each word separated by space. It didn't take then either. Something flickered across his face. Not fear. Not quite. But a recognition that his leverage wasn't working the way he'd calculated. Sarah saw the moment he decided to escalate. She saw it in the tightening of his jaw, the way his hands uncrossed and recrossed, the micro-expression of frustration that told her the supply closet ambush had failed to break her. She walked past him toward the door. He didn't try to stop her. But as she reached for the handle, a single tear, one tear, from the corner of her left eye, escaped and traced down her cheek. She wiped it away without breaking stride, without breaking eye contact, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her dissolve. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 8 years of military discipline compressed into a single moment of refusal. By 0700 the same morning, after her shift had technically ended, Sarah was completing her final charting when the overhead page came again. "All nursing staff, parking lot briefing, 0710 hours." It wasn't a request. It was a command performance. She grabbed her bag and walked to the ambulance bay where morning shift crews were unloading supplies, where the early Virginia light turned everything sharp and unforgiving. Dr. Caldwell stood near the stretcher racks, hands in his white coat pockets, waiting for everyone to gather. She counted 11 nurses within earshot when he spoke. "Sarah, I need to inform you of an immediate staffing adjustment." His voice carried that clinical tone, the one he used during rounds when discussing test results and prognosis. The one that made bad news sound inevitable. "Effective immediately, you're reassigned to pediatric rotations pending a full background investigation. Your ICU access is revoked. Your badge will be reprogrammed within the hour." The silence was absolute. The morning shift nurses exchanged glances. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, pity, curiosity, judgment. She stood in her scrubs, with a dog tag cold and heavy against her collarbone beneath the thin fabric, and took one measured breath. Then another. Her right hand moved to her left shoulder in a small, controlled motion, not a flinch, just an acknowledgement of the weight she was carrying. She nodded once, a single movement that conveyed no emotion, no argument, no defense. "Understood, Dr. Caldwell," she said, and her voice was granite. She turned and walked toward the parking lot without another word. Behind her, she heard a nurse whisper something. Caldwell's shoes clicking on concrete as he moved away. The distant wail of an ambulance siren, approaching from the interstate with a patient she would no longer be trusted to treat. Sarah reached her car, a 10-year-old Honda with Virginia plates and 147,000 miles, and sat in the driver's seat without turning the key. Her hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2. Perfect position. Perfect control. Through the windshield, she could see Caldwell standing near the ambulance bay entrance, watching her car, satisfied that he'd successfully isolated her. What he didn't understand was that Sarah Chen had been isolated before. She'd been separated from her unit in Sanjin Valley while operating under rules of engagement that only existed in classified briefings. She'd been buried alive by paperwork and official denials after that operation was scrubbed from the record. She'd watched 16 families receive folded flags without ever being told how their soldiers died. Isolation was a tool she'd learned to use like a weapon. Over the next 72 hours, the pattern became clear. Caldwell wasn't just sidelining her, he was systematically dismantling her position with the precision of someone trained to cover his tracks. The supply closet had been an emotional probe. The parking lot announcement had been public destruction of her credibility. But the systematic isolation that followed was institutional sabotage. He rotated her shift so that her schedule never aligned with her allies in the ICU. She worked days one week, rotating to swing shift the next, then nights, then back again. Circadian disruption was a known interrogation technique. Stay tired enough and people made mistakes. Made confessions. Caldwell was betting on her making both. Her computer access was restricted on the grounds of the pending investigation, which meant she couldn't pull patient files or access the hospital's medical records system. Rodriguez, the Marine veteran in hospital IT, noticed because Rodriguez had trained her on 3 different hospital systems over her tenure. He brought her a printout of her terminal usage logs, 9 months of consistent access, suddenly revoked in a single keystroke. He didn't ask why. He just left the paper on her locker shelf where she'd find it. Sarah understood the play. Commander Hartley's injury report contained details that didn't fit the official narrative. Entry wounds that didn't match the angle of the blast that supposedly caused them. Shrapnel patterns consistent with 5.56 NATO rounds, not the ordnance the military's official account claimed. The kind of discrepancies that only someone with classified knowledge would recognize. Someone like a major in the 75th Ranger Regiment who'd been at Bagram when the extraction went wrong. Someone like Sarah Chen. Caldwell was moving her away from that bedside not because he feared her competence, but because he knew what she'd find if given access to that patient's file. He'd helped bury an operation 6 years ago. He'd signed off on the documentation that erased 16 deaths and blamed it on weather conditions and mechanical failure. If Sarah spends time near that bedside, if she hears Hartley's story, if she connects the dots between his wounds and what she knows about the Bagram operation, then suddenly everyone involved becomes complicit in a cover-up that reaches higher than a Norfolk hospital's administrative office. The ICU nurses who'd worked alongside Sarah were reassigned to different departments. Caldwell made the calls personally, citing staffing adjustments and seasonal demands. Within 72 hours, her closest allies had been scattered across pediatrics, emergency, and the surgical ward. The message was surgical in its precision: you have nowhere to go, no one to talk to, no access to the patient. Disappear. Sarah continued her work in pediatrics with the kind of quiet dignity that made the other nurses uncertain how to treat her. She was too composed, too professional, too unaffected by the public humiliation. Some of them whispered that she must have done something serious to warrant Caldwell's attention. Others simply avoided her, the way people avoid anything that might contaminate them by proximity. She worked 12-hour shifts in a pediatric ward, teaching a 6-year-old with leukemia how to draw blood from a practice arm, and during her breaks she stood by the stairwell windows that overlooked the ICU hallway below. She watched Hartley's room. Watched the minimal staffing Caldwell had arranged. Watched the night shifts run skeleton crews while that bedside stayed as isolated as a quarantine ward. She recognized the tactic. She'd seen it before, right before operations got buried and witnesses disappeared. Right before the people who knew too much learned to stop talking. Over the next 72 hours, Dr. Caldwell moved like a man solving a problem. The problem had a name. It had a heartbeat. It carried dog tags under scrubs. He started with the schedule. A simple shift rotation, nothing that would trigger HR flags, nothing that would look deliberate to anyone reading the staffing matrix at face value. Sarah was pulled from the night rotation on Hartley's ward and reassigned to pediatrics. 2 nights later, moved to the East Wing surgical recovery. Then back to nights, but on a different floor entirely, separated from the ICU by 3 corridors and a locked access door. Each reassignment came with a professional email citing operational needs, cross-training opportunities, staff development initiatives. All correct. All perfectly legal. All precisely calculated to keep her away from one patient's chart. The hospital's shift supervisor, Patricia, noticed the pattern first. She caught Sarah in the break room at 2,300 hours, a half-empty coffee cup between them, and kept her voice low. "He's moving you on purpose. I've worked here 12 years. I know how rotations work. This isn't normal." Sarah had nodded once, thanked her, and said nothing else. Nodding was safer than speaking. Speaking required her to explain why Caldwell would orchestrate this, and that explanation lived in a classified file somewhere in the Pentagon basement. Then came the access restrictions. The ICU wing required a badge that authorized entry to restricted patient areas. The system was designed for security and HIPAA compliance. On Tuesday morning, Sarah swiped her badge at the ICU checkpoint. Green light. She made it 5 steps into the corridor before the system locked her out entirely. An automated email appeared in her inbox 40 minutes later. "Your access level has been reviewed and adjusted to match your current assignment. Contact HR for appeals." Caldwell had signed off on it personally, using language that suggested a routine review, nothing adversarial. Just protocol. Just procedure. Just enough rope to watch her hang herself if she tried to fight it. But that wasn't the worst part. By Thursday, Caldwell had made 4 phone calls. The first went to the HR director, requesting a full background check on all contract staff, citing emerging compliance concerns. The second went to the State Nursing Licensing Board, initiating an inquiry into the qualifications Sarah had submitted when she was hired. The third went to the staffing agency that had placed her, asking pointed questions about verification procedures and whether they'd properly screened military-adjacent applicants. The fourth call was the one that made Sarah's blood pressure climb to numbers that would have gotten her admitted if she'd been wired to a monitor. He called the Department of Defense. Specifically, he reached out to a former colleague from his medical school rotation, a man named Dr. Holloway, who now worked in security affairs for a 3-letter agency that dealt with exactly the kind of black site operations that got buried under 6 layers of classified briefing papers. Caldwell's voice on that call had been casual, friendly even. "Running across an interesting situation here. Contract nurse, excellent credentials, but something about her background doesn't quite add up. Military adjacent, if you know what I mean. Thought you might appreciate a heads up." It was a fishing expedition disguised as professional courtesy. It was a test to see if Sarah's classified past would surface, if her name would trigger any alerts, if the Pentagon would suddenly take notice and request her removal before she could access anything she shouldn't. He was flushing her out. The staffing matrix for the 4th night showed Caldwell's handiwork in its purest form. The on-call surgeon, Dr. Mitchell, competent and reliable, was assigned to cover the South Wing that evening, handling a post-operative trauma case that would keep him occupied until 0700. The ICU was scheduled with skeletal staffing, a single resident who was expected to float between 7 patients, a respiratory therapist who rotated between floors, and night nurses whose assignments kept them concentrated on the Western Corridor. The Eastern Corridor, where Commander Hartley's room sat like a mine waiting to detonate, was deliberately undermanned. And Sarah was scheduled for the night shift. Not in the ICU, Caldwell had made that impossible. But in the adjacent wing, close enough that she'd see the monitors, far enough that she wasn't officially responsible. It was a masterpiece of administrative cruelty, give her proximity to the truth while making it technically impossible for her to act. Sarah understood what was happening by 1900 hours on the fourth night. She was sitting in the break room, reading through the staffing assignments Caldwell had posted that afternoon, and the pattern became visible. This wasn't random. This wasn't bureaucratic carelessness. This was a man moving chess pieces, and she was the piece he was trying to sacrifice. Caldwell knew. Not about the court-martial specifically, she'd been sealed, erased, legally non-existent in military records. But he knew about Bagram. He knew the operation had been buried. He knew that if she accessed Hartley's injury report, she would see the discrepancies that matched the black site extraction that had cost 16 lives and 3 flag officers' credibility. And he was using the hospital's own systems to trap her, keep her close enough to be tempted, far enough away to be unable to help when the moment came. This was the real game. Not the public humiliation that had been performance art, display dominance, establish authority. This was the endgame. This was a man ensuring that a witness who knew too much could neither speak nor act nor interfere with whatever needed to stay buried. Sarah sat in the break room, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold, and felt the weight of the dog tag beneath her scrubs. The metal was warm from her skin, smooth from 6 years of being touched, pressed, held. It was the only proof she'd ever existed as anything other than what appeared on her current hospital badge. Everything else had been deleted. Her service record. Her rank. Her name in any official capacity. Everyone had told her that staying disappeared was the safest option. Acceptance meant survival. Anonymity meant breathing. Caldwell had just reminded her what happened when you tried to be invisible while people were still dying. She clocked in at 2,200 hours. Her assignment was the step-down recovery wing, patient stable enough to leave ICU but not stable enough for the general ward. The wing was quiet. The monitors beeped in their familiar rhythm, a sound like time being counted in increments. She made rounds, checked charts, documented vitals. Everything textbook. Everything correct. Everything designed to look like she was exactly what her hospital ID claimed, just a contract nurse doing a night shift. By 01:45, the hospital had settled into the specific silence of deep night. The kind of silence that comes when most people are asleep and the skeleton crew is holding the line. The kind of silence where sounds carry weight. Sarah was restocking the medication cart in the recovery wing supply room when the first alarm sounded. High-pitched. Insistent. A heart rate monitor screaming its electronic warning into the empty corridor. She recognized the tone immediately. It was coming from the ICU. Specifically, from the eastern corridor where Commander Hartley's room sat on the careful schedule that Caldwell had constructed. Her hands went still on the medication bottles. The alarm continued. No response. No footsteps. The resident who was supposed to cover that wing was currently intubating a post-op patient on the surgical floor. The respiratory therapist was charting medication updates 2 floors down. The nurses assigned to the ICU were in the western corridor, where the staffing had been concentrated. The eastern corridor had been left deliberately thin. Sarah moved into the hallway. Muscle memory took over. The dog tag felt heavy against her collarbone as she approached the locked ICU access point and swiped her badge. Red light. Denied. The alarm continued. A second monitor joined it, BP alert. Systolic dropping. The sound was a language she understood at the level of reflex and training. The kind of language that required 3 tours and field medicine and the specific knowledge of what happens when human physiology begins its final descent. She could call for help. That was the protocol. That was the procedure. That was what a contract nurse was supposed to do: press the call button, wait for authorized personnel, maintain her role. But she could see through the small window in the ICU door. She could see the monitors. She could see the numbers dropping like a countdown. Dr. Caldwell appeared in the corridor behind her at 01:48. He moved with the calm of a man executing a plan, his voice clinical and precise. "I've called Dr. Mitchell. He's 20 minutes out. You're not authorized to enter this wing, Sarah. Step back." Sarah turned to look at him. His face was composed. His hands were steady. He looked like a man who had already decided what the outcome of this night would be. She looked back at the window. At Hartley's room. At the monitors beyond the glass. BP 68/40 and dropping. Heart rate 138, irregular. The kind of vital signs that spelled words like cascade failure and irreversible shock, and how quickly a human body could fail when the right systems collapsed at the right moment. "You can fire me after," Sarah said. Her voice came out level. Measured. Belonging to someone who had made a decision and would not unmake it. "Move." She walked toward the ICU door. Not toward Caldwell. Not toward the call button or the protocol or the chain of command that he had spent 72 hours carefully constructing. Toward the door that would lock her out if her badge wouldn't work. Toward the window where she could see her former commanding officer's heart rate dropping like a stone through water. Caldwell didn't physically block her. He simply stepped aside, his phone already in his hand, already recording her unauthorized entry into the restricted wing. She heard him dictating notes as she moved past 01 for 8 hours. Unauthorized entry by contract nursing staff into ICU wing. Patient assignment outside her scope of authority. Violation of multiple protocols. Building a record. Creating documentation. Writing the termination letter before she even reached the crash cart. The alarm screamed louder as she entered the ICU corridor. Hartley's monitor showed flat line. The flat line stretched across the monitor like a prophecy. Sarah moved before the sound reached her ears. The alarm screamed louder, higher pitched than fear, and she was already running, 3 years of night shift protocols shattered by muscle memory older than her civilian license. The ICU corridor stretched empty. Fluorescent panels buzzed overhead, indifferent to catastrophe. 0200 hours. On-call surgeon was 47 minutes away, stuck on Interstate 5 behind a jackknifed produce truck. Caldwell had scheduled it this way. Everyone understood now. The unit was hers alone. Commander Hartley's monitor showed the signature pattern she'd seen before, a rapid descending spiral of pressures that matched the discrepancies in his injury report. The ones that shouldn't exist. The ones Caldwell had buried. His heart rate climbed, 138. 156, 171. His oxygen saturation dropped from the high 80s into the 70s. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, steady and useless because his lungs weren't the problem. Sarah pushed through the ICU doors into his room. Hartley lay unconscious, the machines around him painting a story in red and green numbers. Blood pressure 68/42 and falling. Hemorrhagic shock. Massive internal bleed from an injury that his official file claimed was superficial. She'd memorized those lies 3 days ago when Caldwell's sabotage finally locked her out of everything else. No time for protocol. No time for fear. No time for the nurse she'd pretended to be. She grabbed the crash cart, silver, metal and promise, and rolled it toward the bed. The scalpel sat in its tray where it always did, gleaming like an accusation. 10 centimeters of surgical steel. She'd held one exactly like it 6 years ago in a burning helicopter outside Bagram, sweat dripping into her eyes while rounds punched through fuselage and a pilot with a sucking chest wound was bleeding out against her hands. Her hands remembered. That was the problem. That was the gift. That was the reason Caldwell needed her gone. Sarah made the first incision at 0203 hours. Left anterolateral thoracotomy. The same cut she'd performed in Afghanistan, in field hospitals, in the kind of dark where you couldn't see the wound, only felt it, trusted your muscle memory, let your training become prayer. The scalpel parted skin like water. Blood welled immediately, hot and urgent. She ignored it. The second incision went deeper, between the ribs. Rib retractor from the crash cart. She'd need space. She'd need access. She'd need to reach inside his chest and do with her own hands what a surgeon would do with instruments in a controlled OR 3,000 miles away. 40 seconds. That's all it took to crack his chest wide open. His ribs spread like pages of a book she'd already read. The pericardium came next, the tough membrane around his heart. One slash. The sac of fluid that surrounded it drained in a dark rush. And there was the heart. Still trying. Still beating despite the massive hemorrhage pooling in his left chest cavity. She could see the puncture wound in the left ventricle, not from combat, not from the official story Caldwell had filed. From a knife. Someone's knife. Someone who'd known exactly where to place it. The black site operation. The one that killed 16 people. The extraction that went catastrophically wrong. Sarah's right hand went into the chest cavity. Her fingers found the heart's apex. She cupped it like prayer and began to compress. Manual cardiac massage. No machines. No dignity. Just her hand, his heart, and 8 hours of time she'd have to steal from protocol and conscience and the version of herself that wore scrubs and asked permission. She positioned her left hand on the bed rail and began to calculate. Epinephrine 1 mg 4 push, she ran the line up through his arm, careful not to dislodge the central catheter. Sodium bicarbonate to buffer the acidosis building in his blood. 2 units of uncrossed O-negative blood hanging from the rapid infuser. She moved between the monitor and the bed and the 4 poles with one hand, her other hand staying inside Hartley's chest, her fingers maintaining the rhythm of compression that meant the difference between alive and dead. 0215, 0230. 0245. Her arm burned. Real pain, not the abstract kind. The kind that meant muscles were shaking, that lactic acid was building, that her body was screaming that this wasn't possible. Nobody performed manual cardiac massage for this long. Nobody's hand could stay steady. Nobody could keep the rhythm while thinking clearly enough to manage medications and monitor pressures and watch the clock that was moving too slowly. But nobody was a major in the 75th Ranger Regiment. Nobody had spent 3 tours keeping soldiers alive in conditions that made this ICU room look like a 5-star resort. Nobody had held a man's beating heart in her palm in the dark while explosions walked closer and the pilot was asking if they were going to make it and she said yes because lying was its own form of courage. 0300, 0330. 0400. Hartley's O2 sat climbed from 68 to 71 to 78 to 84. His heart rate settled into something almost normal. His blood pressure crept up, 72 over 48. 76 over 52. Not good. Not safe. But alive. Still alive. The internal bleeding had slowed because her hand was preventing complete exsanguination, because her body had become a temporary organ replacement, because for 8 hours she was no longer a nurse. She was a machine. She was necessity. She was what happened when training never left your bones. Dawn came through the ICU windows like an interrogation. Grey light across the monitors. Grey light across her arm, deep inside a man's chest, her hand moving with the automatic precision of someone who'd already done this in worse conditions. In the dark. In pain. In the kind of fear that doesn't announce itself, it just makes you move faster. 09 for 5 hours. The morning shift arrived in pairs, talking about night incidents, weekend plans. They stopped talking when they saw her. For nurses and a resident froze in the doorway. The monitors showed a stable rhythm. The patient's color had improved. His pressure was holding. And a contract nurse, a night shift nobody, was standing beside his bed with her arm inside his chest cavity, her eyes never leaving the monitors, her expression empty of everything except data. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Sarah felt their stares like weight. She didn't break eye contact with the monitors. The resident stepped forward first, voice shaking. "I can take over." Sarah withdrew her hand slowly. 8 hours of continuous compression. Her fingers had cramped so badly she couldn't straighten them. Blood ran down her forearm in dark streaks. The resident took her place, his hands looking absurdly clean, absurdly temporary. She stepped back and let the machinery of a proper hospital take over, the resident calling for continued pressers, the nurses running fresh fluids, the attending who'd been paged 10 minutes ago already jogging toward the room. Sarah walked to the scrub sink in the corridor. The soap was cold. The water ran pink, then red, then finally clear. She watched blood spiral down the drain like it was someone else's story. Protocol violation. Unauthorized procedure. Exceeding scope of practice. Dr. Caldwell's voice came from behind her. She could hear him arriving, the starch in his coat, the weight of his shoes on tile, the precise timing of someone who always planned his entrances. Sarah dried her hands without turning around. Paper towels, one after another, the sound of fabric being crushed. "You're fired. Effective immediately." Caldwell's voice was clinically calm, almost pleasant. "Remove your badge at the security desk. Your employment record will reflect gross misconduct and violation of patient autonomy protocols." Sarah turned to face him. Her eyes were clear. Her voice was steady. "He would have died. That's not your decision to make." She walked past him toward the locker room. Behind her, she heard him moving toward the nurse's station. She heard him calling security. She heard the machinery of institutional power clicking into motion, his phone pressed against his ear, his voice explaining an emergency termination to HR, his fingers already typing an email to the state licensing board. By the time she'd showered the blood from beneath her fingernails, he'd called the staffing agency. By the time she'd put on civilian clothes, he'd sent a message to a Department of Defense contact, flagging her name for background review, a casual, professional red flag about a contract nurse whose credentials might not be what they appeared to be. That evening, Sarah descended into the basement corridor toward the hospital laundry. The fluorescent lights were dimmer here. The sounds were muffled, water running through massive machines, steam rising from the industrial press. A janitor pretended not to notice as she walked past, carrying her folded scrubs. Faded blue fabric. 3 years of night shifts. 3 years of being invisible. She placed the scrubs in the bin marked for disposal and walked back upstairs. Her hands were clean now. Her uniform was gone. The single dog tag hung cold against her collarbone, still beneath her collar, still hidden, still the only proof she'd ever been anything other than someone who pushed a mop. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It ended careers. Dr. Caldwell found her in the basement corridor at 0847, still wearing scrubs stained with Commander Hartley's blood. His voice came first, clinically precise as a scalpel. "You're terminated. Effective immediately." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Protocol violations. Unauthorized procedures. Using equipment without clearance. Open cardiac massage performed by unlicensed personnel. Each charge fell like a gavel strike. Sarah stood motionless, her hand still trembling slightly, not from fear, but from 8 hours of manual cardiac compression, muscle memory fighting against the weight of what she'd done. She didn't respond. Caldwell continued, his tone suggesting he was reading from a manual rather than firing someone who'd just saved a man's life. "You'll return your credentials immediately. Your badge access is being revoked as we speak. Don't bother with the paperwork. Security will escort you out." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their sterile buzz filling the silence between them. He turned to leave, then paused, his silhouette sharp against the concrete wall. "I've already contacted the state licensing board and your staffing agency. They'll be hearing from me within the hour. Unauthorized medical intervention without proper supervision is a serious matter, Ms. Chen. Very serious." He didn't wait for a response. He was already on his phone before the elevator doors closed, his voice dropping low as he spoke to someone on the other end, a call that would reach the Department of Defense before lunch. The calls multiplied throughout the morning like an infection spreading through hospital channels. The state licensing board received a formal complaint by 0920. The staffing agency got a follow-up call at 0945, Caldwell's voice steady and authoritative as he described Sarah's reckless endangerment and clear unfitness for civilian practice. By 1100, he'd made contact with a former colleague in the Department of Defense, a man whose name appeared in redacted sections of files Sarah would never be allowed to read. That conversation lasted exactly 4 minutes. Caldwell mentioned background irregularities, classified personnel, security concerns. He used the phrase "someone who shouldn't be in the system" twice. The DoD colleague promised to flag her clearance for immediate review. Within 90 minutes, a computer somewhere in Arlington, Virginia registered an inquiry that would trigger a cascade of notifications through databases Sarah didn't know existed. The machinery Caldwell had set in motion was efficient and relentless, designed not to arrest or investigate openly, but to erase silently. Sarah walked down to the hospital laundry in the basement just before her shift should have ended. The basement smelled like bleach and industrial detergent, that chemical odor sharp enough to cut through exhaustion. She pushed through the heavy double doors and approached the collection bins, where a janitor in a faded gray uniform was sorting dirty scrubs into hospital-grade washers. He saw her approaching, recognized the look in her eyes, and suddenly became very interested in the lint trap. He didn't ask questions. He didn't want to know anything about the woman in bloodstained blue holding a folded pile of fabric like it was a flag. Sarah placed her scrubs into the bin slowly, deliberately, her hands moving through the motions as if she were lowering something into a grave. 3 years of night shifts. 217 overnight rotations. 73 different patients whose names she'd memorized even though she wasn't supposed to. The scrubs were thin now, worn soft at the elbows where she'd leaned over beds. There was a small hole near the left pocket where a scalpel had torn the material during a code blue in February. She looked at that hole for a long moment, then folded the fabric one final time and let it go. The janitor pretended to whistle, his eyes fixed on the washing machine in front of him. He'd seen this before. He knew what erasure looked like. Sarah turned and walked back toward the staff lockers, past the old equipment storage and the backup generator that hummed like a dying animal. At her locker, Sarah's hand moved to her collarbone, beneath the collar of her street clothes now, and found the dog tag hanging there on a broken chain. The chain was old silver, tarnished nearly black, and the tag itself bore a serial number that had been officially removed from every database in 2018. She held the cold metal between her fingers, feeling its weight. That tag was the only proof she'd ever existed as anything other than invisible. Not a nurse. Not Sarah Chen. Major Sarah Chen, service number stamped into metal that no official record acknowledged anymore. She'd worn it beneath her scrubs every day for 6 years, a single syllable of defiance hidden under hospital blue. Now the hospital blue was gone. She was just a woman in jeans and a gray jacket, touching a piece of military history that the Pentagon pretended didn't exist. The dog tag pressed against her skin, small and cold and true. Within 36 hours, the machinery Caldwell had activated collided with a database he didn't know about. The background check he demanded, intended as a final blow, a way to confirm that Sarah was exactly who he needed her to be, instead flagged something that didn't belong in the system. A classified security clearance. Active status. Attached to the name of someone who was supposed to be a civilian contract nurse with basic credentials. The Defense Security Service algorithm tagged it as an anomaly. An error. Impossible. They escalated it to their supervisor, who escalated it to someone higher, who made a call to someone in a different building entirely. Within 4 hours, that call had become a conference. Within 6 hours, the conference had become official. Within 36 hours, a notice went out, investigate this clearance immediately. Someone in the system was not who they claimed to be. The hospital conference room at Seattle General had windows overlooking the parking lot, and the morning light came in pale and institutional. Sarah sat at the far end of the table, still wearing the gray jacket, the dog tag now visible against her collarbone. She'd been told to report here at 0900. No one had explained why. The room filled gradually with people she hadn't seen in 6 years. Some she hadn't seen in longer. A Navy captain in dress uniform entered first, followed by a woman in lieutenant's insignia whose face was a younger version of Commander Hartley's. A SEAL Team 3 Master Chief with scars on his forearms that told stories nobody would ever ask about. 3 people in FBI windbreakers who walked with the particular confidence of people authorized to arrest federal officers. A hospital IT director named Rodriguez in Marine Corps veteran tattoos and a polo shirt, carrying a laptop. And then Dr. Caldwell, escorted by security, still in his white coat, his face a map of someone realizing that the ground beneath him was no longer solid. Commander Hartley's daughter stood first, her uniform sharp as a blade. Her voice didn't shake, but there was something in it that sounded like thunder held back. Major Chen held my father's heart in her hands. Both times. She said it to the room. She didn't look at Sarah. She was looking at her father's killer, the man in the white coat, the man who'd tried to bury her father's truth along with 16 other bodies. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that comes just before a verdict. Just before the world changes shape. A nurse from the ICU, Sarah had worked shifts with her, never spoke to her, stood with trembling hands and opened a classified Pentagon file. Her voice wavered as she read, Active Commission. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Combat Medical Badge. Each word landed like a fist. The file folder bore the Department of Defense seal. The dates matched. The service record was real, officially real, no longer erased. The nurse's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Sarah and kept reading. Field surgical operations. 14 confirmed saves in theater. Mentioned in 4 separate after-action reports for extraordinary performance under fire. The SEAL Master Chief stepped forward next, and when he spoke, it wasn't to the room. It was directly to Commander Hartley. Major Sarah Chen performed a field thoracotomy in a burning UH-60 during the Bagram extraction. Direct fire, incoming rounds, and she didn't stop working. That's not nursing, sir. That's combat. He turned to face the room. That's a Marine. That's a soldier. That's someone who bled for this country. Behind him, 2 other SEALs in civilian clothes nodded in unison, their movements synchronized by years of shared missions. The FBI agent's voice was steady, official, the voice of machinery that could not be stopped or questioned. The Bagram operation file is being reopened as of today. 16 families will receive full disclosure. 16 bodies will receive proper burial honors. Anyone who participated in concealing the after-action reports will face federal charges. Obstruction of justice. Conspiracy. Witness intimidation. He looked directly at Dr. Caldwell. You're under investigation, Dr. Caldwell. Don't leave Norfolk. Dr. Caldwell's face went the color of old bone. His hands moved to grip the table edge, and for the first time, Sarah saw the machine that had tried to erase her understand that it was being dismantled. Rodriguez opened his laptop, and the conference room filled with photographs of security footage. Caldwell's hands deleting files. Caldwell's voice on audio transcripts, the Chen problem, containment protocols. The timestamps matched his calls to the Department of Defense. The keystroke logs showed him trying to erase Sarah's badge access records. The emails, recovered from backup servers he didn't know existed, detailed his strategy to keep her away from Commander Hartley's medical files. Every move he'd made to silence her was now evidence against him. Rodriguez spoke quietly, his Marine voice carrying more authority than a shout. I recognized the pattern, sir. Same thing they tried with witnesses in Fallujah. I kept copies of everything. 2 federal agents took Dr. Caldwell out of the room with their hands on their duty belts, not their weapons, which somehow made it worse. The hospital CEO announced his immediate termination while the room was still standing. The FBI agent stayed, and behind him appeared investigators with warrant paperwork. They found Caldwell's communications with the DoD colleague who'd helped bury the original Bagram operation, messages discussing the Chen problem and containment protocols and permanent solution. Over the following weeks, investigators would reconstruct what happened, a botched extraction at a black site in Loga province, 16 killed by friendly fire from an Apache gunship that was never supposed to be in that location, 3 generals signing off on falsified reports. And Major Sarah Chen, the only survivor who'd been inside the operation, the only person who'd treated the wounded and seen the shrapnel patterns and understood exactly what had happened. She'd been court-martialed by Commander Hartley in a closed session, ordered to erase herself, seal her records, disappear. She'd obeyed. For 6 years, she'd been invisible. Until the night she chose a patient's life over her own survival. 6 months later, Sarah wore her oak leaves openly. The uniform was crisp and dark, her insignia reflecting light like promises kept. Seattle General had created a new wing, the Military Veteran Surgical Wing, and Major Sarah Chen was its director. When she walked through the ICU, former service members recognized something in her bearing, in the way she moved like someone who'd held death in her hands and refused to let go. Commander Hartley had recovered fully. He'd testified at the federal hearings that reopened the Bagram investigation, his daughter beside him. Both of them had credited Major Chen with saving his life twice, once in combat, once in defiance of orders meant to silence them both. The 16 families received answers, burial benefits, and apologies from a Pentagon forced to acknowledge the truth. Dr. Caldwell worked the night security entrance at Seattle General now, checking visitor badges under fluorescent lights in an ill-fitting gray uniform. His medical license was revoked. Federal probation kept him in Norfolk for 5 more years. Sometimes Sarah passed him on her way to the ICU, and his eyes dropped immediately, his jaw clenching slightly. The man who tried to erase her was now invisible in the building he'd once controlled. She never spoke to him. She just touched the dog tag beneath her collar, no longer hidden, and continued to the ward where Marines and soldiers and Coast Guardsmen received care from someone who understood. On her office wall hung a photograph, Lieutenant Hartley in service dress, pinning oak leaves on Sarah's uniform while 3 rows of uniformed veterans stood at attention and saluted. Hospital staff watched from the back in silence, finally seeing what had always been there. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you were buried by command and cover-up, if you served with honor and were told to disappear, this is your moment. Major Sarah Chen's public authority as director signals that the system's erasure protocols are finally being dismantled. Your story matters. Your service matters. Come forward. Tell your truth. The Pentagon is finally listening. Like this video if you believe in honoring those who served. If you have military in your family, past or present, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. Subscribe and let's keep going.